So I'm standing there in my tux, 30 minutes before I'm supposed to walk down the aisle, and my best man just dropped the most devastating bomb on me. The guy I've known since college, the one who was supposed to have my back through everything, had been keeping this massive secret about my bride. I'm talking about something that would completely change everything I thought I knew about the woman I was about to marry. My hands were shaking as I processed what he'd just told me, and I had to make the hardest decision of my life with hundreds of guests already seated in the chapel. Do I go through with the ceremony and pretend I never heard what I just heard? Or do I blow up my entire wedding day and expose the truth in front of everyone I care about? So I'm Daniel, 29, software engineer. I work at this mid-sized tech company downtown. Nothing too exciting, but it pays well, and I actually enjoy debugging code more than most people would admit. I've been there about 4 years now, ever since I graduated from state. My life was pretty much on track, you know? Good job, decent apartment, and I was about to marry Sarah, this amazing woman I met through mutual friends about 2 years ago. She worked in marketing at a different company, super outgoing and social, where I was more of the quiet type. We balanced each other out really well, or at least that's what I thought. The wedding planning had been going on for almost 8 months. Sarah handled most of it because, honestly, I didn't care much about flower arrangements and seating charts. I just wanted to marry her and start our life together. My best man was going to be Marcus, my roommate from college who I'd stayed close with over the years. He was the obvious choice since we'd been through everything together. Work had been pretty understanding about me taking time off for the wedding. My manager even joked that I better not check email during the honeymoon. The whole team was invited to the reception, and some of them had become friends with Sarah too during company parties and stuff. Everything seemed perfect leading up to the big day. Sarah was excited, our families got along great, and Marcus had been helping me with all the groomsmen coordination. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have everything fall into place so smoothly. I should have known that was too good to be true. The morning of the wedding started exactly how I'd imagined it would. I woke up in the hotel room feeling this mix of excitement and nerves that I'd been expecting for months. Marcus was already up, making coffee with that little machine they had in the room, and he seemed way more awake than I felt. I grabbed a shower first, letting the hot water wake me up properly. When I came out, Marcus had laid out both of our tuxes on the beds, all pressed and ready to go. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life happen. Marcus handed me a cup of coffee and asked how I was feeling. I told him I was nervous but excited, the usual groom stuff. He nodded but didn't really respond the way I expected. Usually Marcus was the one cracking jokes and keeping things light, but he seemed distracted that morning. We started getting dressed, and I was fumbling with my bow tie when I noticed Marcus kept checking his phone. Every few minutes he'd glance at it, frown slightly, then put it back down. I asked him if everything was okay, and he said it was just work stuff. That seemed weird since it was a Saturday and Marcus worked in sales, not exactly the type of job that required weekend emergencies. The photographer showed up around 10 to get some getting ready shots. She had us pose with our ties half done, laughing at something Marcus said, the typical groomsman photos. But I kept noticing that Marcus's smile looked forced. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never been one to fake enthusiasm, so this was throwing me off. While the photographer was setting up different shots, Marcus pulled me aside and asked if I was really sure about everything. I thought he was just doing the best man duty of checking in, so I told him I'd never been more sure about anything in my life. But instead of congratulating me or making some joke about being stuck with Sarah forever, he just nodded and looked uncomfortable. I pressed him about what was bothering him. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, which was something he only did when he was really stressed. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about marriage lately, about how you never really know someone completely. That struck me as an odd thing to say on my wedding morning. The photographer called us back over for more shots, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was trying to tell me something without actually saying it. When she asked us to do a shot of me adjusting his boutonniere, Marcus looked directly at me and said he hoped I knew what I was doing. The way he said it didn't sound like typical pre-wedding jitters. After the photographer left, we had about an hour before we needed to head to the venue. Marcus sat down on his bed and stared at his phone again. I asked him straight out if there was something he needed to tell me. He looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was carrying some heavy burden. Marcus told me that sometimes being a good friend meant knowing when to speak up and when to stay quiet. He said he'd been wrestling with something for weeks, trying to figure out the right thing to do. The way he was talking was making my stomach turn. I demanded to know what he was talking about. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. Marcus said that maybe some things were better left alone, especially on someone's wedding day. But then he turned around and told me that if I ever had any doubts about Sarah, I should trust my instincts. The whole conversation was making me feel sick, but I couldn't get him to be more specific about what he meant. We got to the venue about 2 hours before the ceremony was supposed to start. The place looked incredible, exactly like Sarah had envisioned it. White flowers everywhere, elegant lighting, the works. But I was having trouble focusing on how beautiful everything looked because Marcus was still acting strange. The coordinator showed us to the backstage area where the groomsmen were supposed to wait before the processional. It was this small room behind the main chapel with a couple of chairs and a mirror. The other guys were already there, joking around and taking selfies, but Marcus immediately found a corner and pulled out his phone again. I tried to get into the wedding mood with the other groomsmen, but I kept glancing over at Marcus. He was texting someone pretty intensely, and at one point I saw him type something, delete it, then type something else. His whole body language was tense. About 30 minutes before we were supposed to line up, I heard voices in the hallway outside our room. One of them was definitely Sarah, and she sounded like she was having an urgent conversation with someone. I moved closer to the door to see if everything was okay. Through the crack in the door, I could see Sarah talking to someone, but I couldn't tell who at first. Then the person moved slightly, and I realized it was Marcus. My stomach dropped. What was my bride doing having a private conversation with my best man right before our wedding? I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but I heard Sarah say something about keeping quiet and Marcus responding that he didn't know how much longer he could do this. Then Sarah said something that made my blood run cold. She told him that after today, they wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. The way she said it, with this urgent whisper, made it sound like they were talking about some kind of secret they'd been keeping. I pressed closer to the door, trying to hear more, but then one of the other groomsmen called my name and asked if I was okay. When I looked back through the crack, Sarah and Marcus had separated. Sarah was walking back toward the bridal suite, and Marcus was heading back toward our room. I quickly moved away from the door and pretended to be adjusting my tie in the mirror. Marcus came back in, and I immediately studied his face. He looked relieved, but also guilty, like he'd just finished doing something he wasn't supposed to do. I asked him where he'd been, and he said he'd just stepped out to get some air. I wanted to confront him about what I'd overheard, but the other groomsmen were right there, and I didn't want to cause a scene. Instead, I pulled Marcus aside and asked him directly if there was anything going on between him and Sarah that I should know about. The question hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he started stammering about how Sarah was a great girl and I was lucky to have her. But he wasn't looking me in the eye, and his voice had this shaky quality that I'd never heard before. I pressed harder, telling him I'd seen them talking in the hallway, and it looked pretty intense. Marcus ran his hand through his hair again and said they were just discussing some last-minute wedding details. When I asked what kind of details required such a secretive conversation, he couldn't give me a straight answer. The wedding coordinator knocked on our door and told us we had 15 minutes before we needed to line up. Marcus looked almost relieved at the interruption, but I was feeling more anxious by the minute. Something was definitely wrong, and it involved both my best man and my bride. I decided I needed to talk to Sarah directly. I told the guys I'd be right back and headed toward the bridal suite. Whatever was going on, I needed to know before I walked down that aisle. The bridal suite was at the other end of the venue, past the main chapel where guests were already taking their seats. I could hear the string quartet playing softly as people found their places. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. I knocked on the bridal suite door, and one of Sarah's bridesmaids answered. She looked surprised to see me and reminded me that it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. I told her I just needed to talk to Sarah for a minute, that it was important. Sarah appeared at the door in her wedding dress, and she looked absolutely stunning. For a moment, I forgot why I was there. She smiled and asked what was so urgent that I was breaking tradition. But when I looked closer, I could see tension around her eyes. I asked if we could talk privately. Sarah glanced back at her bridesmaids, then stepped into the hallway with me. I told her I'd overheard her conversation with Marcus and wanted to know what they were discussing. Her smile faltered immediately. Sarah asked what I thought I'd heard. I repeated the parts about keeping quiet and not having to worry about something after today. She laughed, but it sounded forced, and said I must have misunderstood. She claimed they were just talking about Marcus's speech and how nervous he was about public speaking. That explanation didn't make sense because Marcus had never been nervous about public speaking. I told Sarah that, and she quickly changed her story. She said they were actually discussing a surprise they had planned for me, and she couldn't tell me what it was without ruining it. I wanted to believe her, but her body language was all wrong. She wasn't making eye contact, and she kept fidgeting with her bouquet. I asked her directly if there was anything she needed to tell me before we got married. Sarah looked hurt and asked why I would ask such a thing on our wedding day. The wedding coordinator appeared and told us we had 10 minutes before the processional started. Sarah kissed my cheek and said she needed to finish getting ready. She told me she loved me and couldn't wait to be my wife, then disappeared back into the bridal suite. I stood in the hallway feeling completely lost. Nothing about this felt right, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was wrong. I started walking back toward the groomsmen's room, but something made me detour past the coordinator's office. The door was slightly open, and I could see papers scattered across the desk. Most of it looked like typical wedding coordination stuff, but one envelope caught my eye. It was sitting on top of a stack of programs, and it had Marcus's name written on it in Sarah's handwriting. I looked around to make sure no one was watching, then stepped into the office. The envelope wasn't sealed, and I could see the edge of a letter sticking out. Every instinct told me not to look, but I couldn't help myself. I pulled out the letter and immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting. It was dated 3 weeks ago, and it started with my hands started shaking as I read the first few lines. Sarah was telling Marcus how much she loved him and how hard it had been to keep their relationship secret. The letter went on to say that after the wedding, they could finally be together without having to hide. She wrote about how guilty she felt about deceiving me, but that she couldn't call off the wedding without destroying both families. She promised Marcus that once she had access to my finances and we were legally married, they could figure out a way to be together permanently. I read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My bride and my best man had been having an affair, and they were planning to continue it after our marriage. Sarah was essentially using me for financial security while planning to be with Marcus. The wedding coordinator's voice echoed down the hallway, calling for the groomsmen to line up. I quickly folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do with this information. I walked back to the groomsmen's room in a daze. Marcus looked up when I entered, and I could see the guilt written all over his face. He asked if I was okay because I probably looked as sick as I felt. The other groomsmen were already lining up, joking about how nervous I looked. Someone made a comment about cold feet being normal, and everyone laughed. But I felt like I was watching everything happen from outside my own body. Marcus came over and put his hand on my shoulder. He asked again if I was all right. I looked directly at him and said I'd found something interesting in the coordinator's office. The color drained from his face, and I knew he understood exactly what I was talking about. The processional music had already started when I pulled Marcus aside in the staging area. The other groomsmen had lined up and were waiting for us to join them. Through the doors, I could see the chapel filled with family and friends, all dressed up and expecting a beautiful ceremony. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. Marcus's eyes went wide when he saw it. I asked him how long this had been going on. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Finally, he whispered that he could explain everything. I told him he had about 2 minutes before we were supposed to walk down the aisle, so he better start talking fast. Marcus looked around desperately, like he was hoping someone would rescue him from this conversation. The wedding coordinator was gesturing for us to join the line, but I ignored her. Marcus finally admitted that he and Sarah had been seeing each other for about 6 months. He said it started innocently, just as friends, but developed into something more. He claimed he'd tried to end it multiple times, but Sarah kept convincing him they were meant to be together. I asked him why he didn't tell me before now. Marcus said he knew it would destroy our friendship and hurt me terribly. He'd been hoping Sarah would call off the wedding herself, but when it became clear she wasn't going to, he didn't know what to do. The wedding coordinator came over and firmly told us we needed to get in line immediately. The music was playing, and people were starting to notice the delay. Marcus looked at her, then back at me, and said maybe we should just get through the ceremony and deal with this later. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked him if he seriously expected me to marry Sarah knowing what I now knew. Marcus ran his hands through his hair and said that maybe it would work out, that maybe Sarah would change her mind about everything once we were married. My mother appeared beside us, looking concerned. She asked if everything was okay because people were starting to whisper about the delay. I looked at her, then at Marcus, then at the doors leading to the chapel where Sarah was waiting at the altar. Marcus grabbed my arm and said he was sorry, that he never meant for any of this to happen. He said Sarah really did care about me, just not in the way a wife should care about her husband. He suggested that maybe I could be happy not knowing the truth, that ignorance might be better than the alternative. I stared at him in disbelief. This was my best man, the person who was supposed to have my back no matter what, and he was suggesting I live a lie. I asked him if he planned to continue seeing Sarah after the wedding. He looked down at the floor and didn't answer, which was answer enough. The coordinator was getting frantic now, telling us that we absolutely had to start the processional. The musicians were looking confused, and I could see my father standing up in the front row, trying to figure out what was happening. Marcus looked at me with this pleading expression and said he was trying to save me from making a huge mistake. He said that maybe this was a sign, that maybe I should be grateful to find out now instead of years down the road. But then he immediately contradicted himself by saying that maybe we should just go through with it and figure everything out later. I realized that Marcus was just as confused and conflicted as I was. He'd been carrying this secret for months, watching me plan a wedding to a woman who was cheating on me with him. The guilt was eating him alive, but he was still too much of a coward to do the right thing. The processional music stopped, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the chapel. I could hear people murmuring and shifting in their seats. My sister appeared at my elbow and asked what was wrong. I looked at her, then at Marcus, then at the letter still clutched in my hand. My sister Emma took one look at my face and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. She pulled me away from Marcus and the other groomsmen into a small alcove near the chapel doors. I could hear the guests getting restless, chairs creaking as people turned to see what was causing the delay. Emma asked me what was happening. I showed her the letter and watched her expression change from confusion to shock to anger as she read it. She looked up at me and asked what I was going to do. I told her I honestly didn't know. She glanced toward the chapel doors, then back at me. Emma said that whatever I decided, she would support me, but that I needed to make a choice quickly. She pointed out that every minute we delayed was making the situation worse for everyone involved. I asked her what she thought I should do. Emma said that was a decision only I could make, but that I deserved better than being married to someone who was planning to deceive me from day one. She reminded me that marriage was supposed to be built on trust and honesty, and Sarah had violated both of those things before we were even married. Marcus approached us cautiously. He'd been watching our conversation from across the staging area, and he looked terrified. Emma gave him a look that could have melted steel, and he actually took a step backward. The wedding coordinator appeared again, this time with my mother in tow. Mom looked worried and asked what was wrong with me. She said I looked pale and that people were starting to ask questions. The coordinator said we absolutely had to start the ceremony in the next 2 minutes or the schedule would be completely thrown off. I looked through the glass doors into the chapel. Sarah was standing at the altar in her beautiful white dress, looking confused and concerned. Her parents were in the front row, along with mine, and everyone was dressed up and expecting a celebration. Emma squeezed my arm and told me that whatever happened, the truth was better than living a lie. She said that if I went through with the ceremony knowing what I knew, I would regret it for the rest of my life. She reminded me that I was only 29 and had plenty of time to find someone who would love and respect me the way I deserved. Marcus came closer and said he knew I was angry, but that maybe we could work something out. He suggested that maybe he could transfer to a different city for work, that maybe he and Sarah could end things after the wedding. The way he was talking made it clear he still didn't understand how wrong this whole situation was. I asked Marcus if he loved Sarah. He hesitated, then nodded. I asked him if Sarah loved him. He nodded again. Then I asked him why he thought it was okay for me to marry someone who was in love with another man. That question seemed to hit him hard. Marcus looked down at his shoes and admitted that it wasn't okay, that none of this was okay. He said he'd been too much of a coward to do the right thing, and now he'd made everything worse by waiting so long. The music director appeared and said they needed to know immediately whether to restart the processional music or make an announcement to the guests. The coordinator was practically vibrating with stress, and I could see members of both families starting to stand up and look toward the back of the chapel. Emma told me I had about 30 seconds to make a decision. She said that whatever I chose, she would stand by me, but that I needed to choose based on what I could live with long term. She reminded me that everyone in that chapel loved me and would understand if I couldn't go through with a marriage built on deception. I looked at Marcus one more time. He was my best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone except Sarah. And he'd betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. But he was also clearly suffering, and I could see that he genuinely regretted what had happened. The coordinator started counting down from 10, saying that if we didn't start the processional immediately, she would have to make an announcement to the guests that there was a delay. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I tried to decide what to do. I made my decision. I told the coordinator to start the processional music, and I got in line with the other groomsmen. Emma looked surprised, but she squeezed my hand and told me she loved me no matter what. Marcus looked relieved, but also confused about what I was planning to do. The chapel doors opened, and I walked down the aisle with my groomsmen. Everyone was smiling and taking pictures, and the atmosphere felt celebratory again. But I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. When I reached the altar, I took my place next to the officiant and waited for Sarah to appear. The bridal march began, and Sarah appeared at the back of the chapel with her father. She looked absolutely radiant, and for a moment I felt a pang of doubt about what I was about to do. But then I remembered the letter in my pocket, and I knew I couldn't go through with this charade. Sarah walked down the aisle smiling at me, and when she reached the altar, her father placed her hand in mine. The officiant began the ceremony with the traditional opening about gathering together to witness the union of Daniel and Sarah. I could feel the letter burning in my pocket. When the officiant reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, I felt my heart racing. This was my moment. I could either let this proceed and live with the consequences, or I could speak up and end this before it went any further. The officiant continued with the vows, asking if I took Sarah to be my lawfully wedded wife. I looked at her, and she was smiling expectantly, waiting for me to say I do. Behind her, I could see Marcus standing with the other groomsmen, looking like he was about to be sick. Instead of answering the question, I pulled the letter out of my pocket. I told the officiant and the congregation that I had something I needed to share before we continued. Sarah's smile faltered when she saw the letter, and I heard Marcus make a small sound behind me. I announced to everyone that I had discovered something that morning that changed everything. I said that I couldn't in good conscience marry Sarah without everyone knowing the truth about what had been going on behind my back. The chapel fell completely silent. I could see my parents looking confused and concerned, and Sarah's parents had the same expression. Sarah reached for the letter, but I held it away from her. I read the first few lines of the letter out loud, the parts about Sarah's love for Marcus and their plans to be together after the wedding. Gasps echoed through the chapel, and I heard someone's mother start crying. Sarah's face went white, and she started shaking her head. Marcus stepped forward from the groomsmen line. He looked at Sarah, then at me, then at the hundreds of people staring at us. I asked him directly, in front of everyone, if what was written in the letter was true. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but after a long pause, he nodded and admitted that he and Sarah had been having an affair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant for it to happen, but that he couldn't deny it anymore. Sarah finally found her voice and tried to explain. She said the letter was old, that it was from a time when she was confused about her feelings. She insisted that she loved me and wanted to marry me. But her explanation sounded hollow after Marcus had already confirmed the truth. The officiant didn't seem to know what to do. He'd probably never had a wedding ceremony interrupted by revelations of infidelity. People in the congregation were talking among themselves, and some were starting to stand up and leave. I looked at Sarah one more time and told her I couldn't marry someone who had been planning to deceive me from the beginning. I said I deserved better than being someone's financial security while she pursued her real relationship on the side. Sarah started crying and begging me to reconsider. She said she would end things with Marcus, that she would do whatever it took to make our marriage work. But I knew it was too late for that. The trust was completely broken, and there was no way to rebuild it. I announced to the congregation that there would be no wedding today. I apologized to everyone for the wasted time and expense, but said I couldn't go through with marrying someone who had been lying to me for months. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Half the congregation was still sitting in stunned silence, while the other half was buzzing with conversation and speculation. Sarah was crying hysterically, and her mother had rushed up to the altar to comfort her. My own parents looked shell-shocked, not quite understanding what had just happened. Marcus had disappeared from the groomsmen line, and I could see him near the side exit, probably trying to escape before anyone could confront him. Some of Sarah's relatives were shooting angry looks in my direction, while others seemed to be directing their anger toward her. The wedding coordinator appeared at my elbow, looking frazzled and asking what she should tell the vendors and the reception venue. I told her to cancel everything, that there wouldn't be a reception or any other wedding events. She nodded and hurried away, probably to start making phone calls. Emma came up to me and asked if I was okay. I told her I felt nauseous but relieved at the same time. She said she was proud of me for having the courage to speak up, even though it couldn't have been easy. She offered to help me deal with the logistics of canceling everything. My father approached and asked if we could talk privately. We stepped into a small room off the main chapel, and he asked me to explain what had just happened. I showed him the letter and told him about the conversation I'd overheard between Sarah and Marcus. Dad read the letter twice, then looked at me with this sad expression. He said he was sorry I'd had to go through this, but that I'd made the right choice. He told me he was proud of me for having the integrity to call off the wedding rather than proceeding with a marriage built on deception. When we came back out, most of the guests had left. A few close family members were still hanging around, probably waiting to see if there would be any further drama. Sarah was sitting in the front pew with her parents and bridesmaids, still crying, but more quietly now. I walked over to where Sarah was sitting and told her I was sorry it had to end this way. I said I genuinely loved her and thought we had a future together, but that I couldn't build a marriage on lies and betrayal. Sarah looked up at me and said she was sorry too, that she'd never meant to hurt me. Her father stood up and faced me. For a moment, I thought he was going to yell at me or blame me for embarrassing his daughter in front of everyone. But instead, he shook my hand and said he understood why I'd done what I did. He said that while he was disappointed for Sarah, he respected my decision to be honest about the situation. The venue coordinator came back and confirmed that she'd canceled the reception and contacted all the vendors. She said there would probably be some financial penalties, but that most of the vendors were understanding about the circumstances. She handed me a folder with all the contracts and told me to contact her office next week to sort out the final details. As people continued to leave, I found myself standing alone in the chapel where I was supposed to have gotten married. The flowers were still beautiful, the decorations were still elegant, but the whole scene felt hollow and meaningless now. Emma came back and suggested we leave before any more awkward conversations could happen. She said Marcus had already left, probably to avoid having to face anyone else. I agreed that it was time to go. As we walked out of the venue, I could see some guests lingering in the parking lot, probably discussing what they just witnessed. I knew this story would be talked about for years in both families, but I felt like I'd made the right choice even if it was painful. 3 days later, I was sitting in my apartment surrounded by wedding gifts that would need to be returned and thank you cards that would never be sent. The silence was overwhelming after months of wedding planning and excitement. Every surface in my place reminded me of Sarah and the life we'd planned together. I'd taken the rest of the week off work, telling my boss I needed some time to deal with personal issues. He'd been understanding without asking for details, which I appreciated. I wasn't ready to explain to my colleagues what had happened at the wedding they'd all been invited to. Emma had been checking on me daily, bringing food and making sure I was eating. She found me that afternoon staring at a pile of wedding photos that Sarah and I had taken during our engagement session. Emma sat down next to me and asked how I was holding up. I told her I was angry, but not just at Sarah and Marcus. I was angry at myself for not seeing the signs earlier. Looking back, there had been little things that should have raised red flags. Sarah had been secretive about her phone, and there were times when Marcus had acted strangely around her. Emma reminded me that hindsight was always clearer, and that Sarah and Marcus had actively worked to hide their relationship from me. She said it wasn't my fault for trusting the two people who should have been most trustworthy in my life. The worst part was feeling like a fool. I'd been planning this elaborate future with someone who was essentially using me as a cover for her real relationship. I kept thinking about all the conversations Sarah and I had about our future together, wondering how much of it had been genuine and how much had been an act. I'd gotten a few text messages from Marcus over the past few days, but I hadn't responded to any of them. He'd apologized multiple times and asked if we could talk, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready for it. Sarah had tried calling once, but I'd let it go to voicemail. In her message, she'd said she wanted to explain everything and try to make things right. But I couldn't imagine what explanation could possibly make this situation acceptable. The financial aspect was another stress I was dealing with. The wedding had cost a significant amount of money, and while some vendors were being understanding about refunds, others were keeping their deposits. I was looking at losing several $1,000s, which hurt on top of everything else. Emma suggested that maybe I should consider talking to a therapist to help process everything that had happened. She said that betrayal by two of the most important people in my life was a major trauma, and that it might help to have professional support while I worked through it. I'd been having trouble sleeping since the wedding day. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying different moments from the past few months, looking for clues I'd missed. I kept wondering if other people had known about Sarah and Marcus's relationship and just hadn't told me. Emma stayed with me that evening, and we ordered pizza and watched mindless TV shows. She didn't try to make me talk about everything or push me to make decisions about the future. She just sat with me and let me process everything at my own pace. Before she left, Emma told me that she knew this felt like the end of the world right now, but that someday I'd be grateful it happened before the wedding instead of after. She said I'd avoided years of unhappiness and eventual divorce, and that the right person was still out there waiting for me. About 3 weeks after the non-wedding, I was finally starting to feel like I could function normally again. I'd gone back to work the previous week, and while it was awkward at first with colleagues who knew what had happened, people were generally supportive and didn't ask too many questions. I was sitting in a coffee shop near my office, the same one where Sarah and I used to meet for lunch sometimes. I'd been avoiding it since everything happened, but that morning I decided it was time to stop letting the past control where I could and couldn't go. A woman at the next table was talking to her friend about her own relationship problems, and I couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation. She was saying that her boyfriend had been acting suspicious lately, and she was trying to decide whether to confront him about it or just ignore her concerns. Her friend was advising her to trust her instincts, that if something felt wrong, it probably was. I found myself wanting to lean over and tell her to definitely trust those instincts, that ignoring red flags never worked out well in the long run. It struck me that a month ago, I would have been the person advising someone to give their partner the benefit of the doubt, to assume the best about people's intentions. Now I realized how naive that perspective had been. Sometimes people really were hiding things, and sometimes those things were relationship ending. I thought about Marcus and whether I'd ever be able to forgive him. Part of me missed our friendship and the history we'd shared, but I couldn't imagine ever trusting him again. The betrayal felt too fundamental, too calculated to be something we could move past. As for Sarah, I'd finally listened to her voicemail messages a few days earlier. She'd left several over the weeks, alternating between apologies and attempts to justify what had happened. In the most recent one, she'd said she was moving to a different city to start over, which was probably for the best. I'd started thinking about dating again, though I wasn't ready to actually do anything about it yet. The idea of trusting someone new with my heart felt terrifying after what had happened. But I also knew I didn't want to let Sarah and Marcus's betrayal turn me into someone who was afraid to love again. Emma had been right about therapy being helpful. I'd started seeing a counselor who specialized in relationship trauma, and it was helping me process not just what had happened, but why I'd ignored some of the warning signs. I was learning to trust my instincts better and to value myself more highly. The financial losses from the wedding were still stinging, but I was managing to recover from them gradually. More importantly, I was starting to see that the money was a small price to pay for avoiding years of an unhappy marriage. Sitting in that coffee shop, watching people go about their normal lives, I realized that I was going to be okay. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also taught me important lessons about trust, honesty, and self-respect. I was stronger than I'd been before, even if I was also more cautious. I finished my coffee and headed back to work, feeling more optimistic about the future then.